Well, thank you very much for the kind welcome and for putting in everyone's minds the image of me in
Visualization.
my...
We're all thinking about it.
Why, yeah, everyone's minds the image of me in my lycra. I thought it was me that was supposed to be imagining you guys in your underwear, but apparently not. I have two excellent panelists joining me. I'm very lucky. They need no introduction, but I have Richard Tang of Binance and Brad Garlinghouse of Ripple. We're going to be discussing the obstacles facing crypto as we think about enabling this next decade of access and growth. Before we do that, I want to just remind everyone to get your questions in through the app. It's rare that we have these two kind of captive on stage, so please do take the opportunity to ask them whatever you will. And we'll spend about 5 minutes at the end on those. Okay, I mean, in discussions like this one, I think the topic that comes up time and again is when we talk about kind of enabling the next decade of access and growth, when we talk about obstacles standing in the way for crypto businesses, is regulatory factors, right? You know, whether that's an absence of rulemaking, whether that's actively hostile regulators, whether that's sort of fragmentation in the kind of global regulatory landscape. So I'd quite like to start there. Richard, if we could start with you, if you don't mind. Something we hear from many members of the industry is that something that's really held businesses back is this absence of clear rules, this kind of confusion over what crypto businesses should be doing in absolutely crucial jurisdictions. I wonder whether you could tell us a little bit about how you expect that picture to change and what will be the result in the year ahead.
Well, so I will start by congratulating Brad, right? So if you look at what is happening in the States, there's a pro-crypto president being elected, and you'll be at the inauguration. And incidentally, XRP hit an all-time high today. So that's something really worth congratulating, right? So the landscape will shift quite substantially over the next 4 years. I think Brad is better placed to speak about those. In the past 4 years, pretty anti-crypto sentiment. Firstly from the States, and then because US has such an outsized influence globally, I think that permeates to many parts, different parts of the world, right? There are still pro-crypto policymakers, pro-crypto regulators out there, but most of them are still cautious, right? So the next 4 years will be quite different on that front. So we are going to move from a period of regulatory uncertainty, lack of regulatory clarity, I suspect, into a period where we're going to face challenges with regulatory harmonization. Because for the places that regulate crypto today, and only about a third of global regulators are regulating crypto, they regulate crypto in very different manner, right? Singapore regulates them as digital payment tokens. Some places you have them as securities. Some places you have commodities. I'm not quite sure whether that debate has been settled in the States yet, whether it's a security or a commodity. And then some jurisdiction, like I think you hear from Deepa earlier on, like Dubai, different parts of Middle East, come out with different definition of digital assets or virtual assets. Right? And all these rules are inconsistent. And they make deployment very difficult globally because you have to just tweak your operations, you have to tweak how you do deployment locally based on the different rules and regulations. That doesn't quite exist in the securities world, asset management world, or banking world, right? So that we will go into that period where you need a long period of time, firstly, for the national agencies that are based in each country to decide who is the lead regulator to regulate this sector and what's the key primary legislation. And then secondly, for these regulators to come together at a global forum to then decide how to harmonize those standards. So we probably go into that period. But having said that, it's much better than the last 4 years.
Sure. I'd like to touch a little bit more later on that kind of fragmentation piece. But I mean, since you mentioned the kind of outsized influence of the US, Richard, Brad, maybe I'll come to you. You know, we've heard a little bit already today about the Trump factor, but I think everyone here would be interested in your perspective in the context of this discussion around the regulatory landscape.
Yeah.
I mean, I wonder whether you could just talk to us briefly about kind of what the full implications are of a transition to ostensibly a pro-crypto administration in the US.
Yeah. Well, look, I violently agree with something Richard said, which is, you know, on one hand, the US GDP is about 22% of global GDP. So there's 78% that, you know, in a lot of those jurisdictions have already been very pro-crypto. But I do also believe that the US has had an outsized impact and kind of just a negative influence which has been super frustrating. And I think the Trump effect, I actually think, is so far still underestimated. And now I always get nervous, and I heard somebody talking yesterday, and they're like, expectations are very high. And when expectations are high, I think more about downside than upside. But I think when the largest economy in the world is, I think, going to shift significantly, and I think there is going to be a Trump effect domestically, but the pun intended ripple effect of that outside the United States, I think, is going to be significant also, where it's just the U.S. has an outsized influence. And look, I think we are continuing to see, with only 4 or 5 days left of this administration, that Gary Gensler has not been acting in good faith. It has been, and I was talking to some people in the audience, and it would be nice to see some accountability at some point on some of these things. I don't think we will. I think people will move on, and to some degree, that's okay. We're going to be in a better place. But I think there's going to be renewed investment in the United States. I think you're going to see more, one of the key topics we're talking about is just unlocking the next 10 years. When the largest economy in the world and the institutions there feel handcuffs off, the business for Ripple in the United States has been frozen for 4 years. They filed a lawsuit in December 2020, and for the last 4 years, our ability to do business in the United States in terms of our signing institutions to use our technologies, it's basically been locked out.
Right.
And that's going to change.
And am I right in thinking that Ripple is already pushing back into the US? Pretty much as soon as the election result came in.
Yeah, beginning really in kind of the second half of 2020, most of our hiring was non-US. Last year, I think non-US hiring was like 78% of the company. Now, that's partly you follow where your customers are. Our business has 95% of our customers are non-US. I'm hopeful that, I've publicly shared that in the 6 weeks after the election, we signed more contracts in the United States than we had in the previous 6 months. So you're seeing, that's even before they've taken office, right? And so I think as we start to see the people that Trump has appointed take seat, affect change, I think we may have underestimated how those headwinds that we've all experienced are going to shift to tailwinds, and I'm very optimistic about what it's going to look like.
Right. And as for Gary Gensler's legacy, this kind of raft of cases against yourselves, against Kraken, Coinbase, Binance, and the rest, what do you expect to happen to those cases in the weeks and the months after Gensler leaves his seat?
Gensler likes to go out and talk about how they've won lots of cases. The reality is they've settled lots of cases because they're bullies, and there's very few people that can stand up to the bully of the United States government. There have been a handful, including Coinbase, and certainly including Ripple, who've stood up and have demonstrated that they have acted outside of what the law has said. And it's frustrating to not be able to have worked constructively and said, hey, look, is there gray area? Does the Howey test work here? Does a test from 1946, I think it was 46, 48, somewhere around there, does it make sense? I have already experienced personally, since the election, the outreach, the engagement with the people coming into office is very real, and they're trying to figure out, hey, let's figure out how to make this work. I think we will see a market structure bill in the United States. When I say market structure, for some people, that'll be, it's FIT 21 was the one that made the most progress. I think some derivative of FIT 21 will pass in the first 6 months. I think there'll be executive orders on day one around everything from SAB 121 to some of the choke point 2.0 stuff. I think it will happen quickly in many ways.
You really think day one? You think that?
I think day one there will be crypto-related executive orders.
Okay,
for sure.
Okay. Richard, when we were speaking a little bit earlier today, that you were telling me that your stance on the US is slightly different to Binance. It's not necessarily that you guys are going to be pushing straight back into that market. Do you want to tell me a little bit about kind of how you guys are looking at it?
Well, as of now, our key focus is our global deployment in the market, right? So just some figures. We started 2024 with 170 million customers. We ended the year north of 240 million. So we acquired 70 million new customers just in 2024 alone. And that makes up roughly 30% of users on our platform, right? So you can see the growth. And 2024 has been a landmark year in many sense, right? So if you think about it, crypto is the only asset class, unlike any other asset class, which are always embraced by institutions and go down to corporates, and then high net worth, and then finally retail. Crypto is the only sector that retail has embraced it for the longest time. The instis are just ignoring it. The regulators are calling it a scam, So, and that whole narrative changed in 2024, right? With the approval of ETF in the States, and then the institutions, Larry Finn of the world, saying that they went from skeptic to a believer after understanding this sector much better, after doing a lot more research, and having acquired much more knowledge into this sector. So that narrative changed quite drastically last year. Catherine is here, she looks after our VIP business, and she'll tell you that last year, the number of institutions that have been onboarded on Binance more than doubled compared to the previous year. So we see quite strong inflows on the institutional side, and our focus has been global. We are licensed in 21 different jurisdictions now. The latest that we secure a regulatory approval is in Brazil. So that makes us the most licensed and regulated exchange globally. So we're going to focus on that. You know of our settlement in the US. So for now, we are just holding a watching brief of what's happening in the US market. One thing in life is never say never. We always keep it under constant review. And let's say when the market sentiment, when the narrative is right, we'll always consider that issue again.
Sure, okay. And you mentioned earlier that this issue around kind of the fragmentation of the regulatory landscape globally. I think, speaking for myself, and I'm sure actually many people in this room as well, many of us are quite used to looking at this issue through a fairly kind of US or Eurocentric lens. You're a former regulator yourself in the APAC region and kind of multiple territories. I wonder whether you could give us some insight into the differences in approach from kind of east to west, which territories are doing it best in your mind, and where the opportunities kind of lay.
I wouldn't say east versus west. I would say that regulators that have a developmental or promotional angle in their mission statement, right? Those regulators tend to do much better because they would, other than their mandate to regulate the risk part of it, they also have a mandate to try to grow the sector and develop the sector. So in my view, those are the regulators that really spend time, energy, and resources to understand this space. And in most instances, they are the one that come up with bespoke framework to just regulate that space. Because if you try to force fit into securities or commodities, it is tough because there are always rules that are archaic, right? So for example, the market structure is totally different for crypto. In traditional finance, you have your traditional exchange, you have the broker-dealer that does all the onboarding, the KYC, the KYB, you have custody that's done by somebody else, right? But because blockchain is a technology that allows us to disintermediate all this, right? So we do the KYB, KYC of customers directly as an exchange, right? So the market structure is very different. When you try to force fit it, and I speak to regulators globally, one of them say, what's your settlement period? Is it T+1, T+2? I say, this is blockchain technology, it's instantaneous. They can't get that concept. What is your clearing fund? How do you manage the clearing risk? I said, look, it clears instantaneously, it's settled instant. So there are still concepts that many traditional regulators struggle with. And that then lies on the biggest challenge. Together with that, if you look at traditional media, we spoke about this earlier, the narrative is money laundering issues, scams, etc. But if you look at data, the amount of money laundered through blockchain in crypto sector, and blockchain is a traceable technology unlike fiat, is only 0.02% of global money laundered, and most of it happens through traditional channels, right, globally. And these are data published by US financial crime agencies. The Monetary Authority of Singapore, which is a very respected central bank, last year published a report to say the majority of money laundered in Singapore is through traditional channels. But that narrative is lost, right? They choose to, for things that people don't understand, they choose to focus on just the negative part of it without understanding that, look, I can trace where the money goes to. And we spend a lot of effort educating law enforcement agencies globally on that front. Last week, we conducted close to 100 classes, both physical as well as virtual classes for law enforcement agencies around the world to highlight to them how do you use the techniques, how do you use this technology to bring about greater enforcement actions and better decision making.
And in terms of, so I appreciate it's kind of Goldilocks problem, like you don't want it to rulemaking to be too rigid nor too fluid. Is there any kind of jurisdiction that you would point to, just in one word, that you think is kind of whose porridge is most delicious?
I would say that I've dealt with quite a number. So normally where is one agency, and normally you're dealing with the smaller countries, where one agency is in charge of both the banking, securities, and insurance market space, they come up with the best policy, normally, because they are in control of all the different arms of regulations. Unlike, for example, US is such a big country and you have different agencies involved and they can't agree who is the primary regulator. Those are the situations that you face a lot of challenges.
Okay. Yeah. And Brad, before we move on from this question around the regulatory landscape, I just want to ask you kind of, to what extent is a kind of optimal regulatory regime the be-all and end-all here? It's something that comes up time and again in discussions around, the pieces of the puzzle that need to align for crypto to kind of realize its kind of ultimate potential.
Yeah.
To what extent is regulation be-all and end-all, and to what extent do other factors need to be fit in?
Well, I don't think it's the be-all, end-all. I mean, I agree. Christian Carlos on stage earlier and commented on the U.S. regulatory environment that you're trying to regulate things we don't fully understand the implications of, right? Had the U.S. tried to regulate TCP/IP or HTTP in 1992, we don't understand how these technologies are going to be used. And you kind of have to see how things evolve a little bit and then figure out, oh, okay, this is how we should apply a regulatory framework around that. I agree with that. That's not really how the U.S. has operated. I mean, as Richard said, I think you have mouthpieces that I would highlight Gary Gensler, but I'd highlight Elizabeth Warren, who are prognosticating, and it's just false facts. They're not telling the truth. They're talking about how it's all used for scams and what have you, and the data does not support it. So I think if you think about the unlock for the next 10 years, regulation is absolutely one of them, but that's obviously not enough. And I think that focusing on utility and how we're actually using these technologies to solve real problems, super important. I think some of the stuff going on in tokenization, and another example where I think we've underestimated the impact. Those are the things I think really unlock. The last one I'll throw out, using the examples I used before, as we think about unlocking the next 10 years, making these technologies easier to use. The last panel was talking about as the UX. I guess that's part of it, but if we didn't have HTML and we were thinking about the expansion of TCP/IP in the early 90s, we wouldn't have the internet as we know it today. And I think we need to the UI layer and just the hiding the complexity. Everybody in this room probably at some point has done the equivalent of a penny test sending crypto. Like, really? At some point, I think we'll graduate beyond that, and there are already companies doing stuff in this space that I think is profound and will continue to see the market grow a lot.
Okay, let's dive a little bit deeper on that utility piece then. It's often said that crypto eventually will need to recede into the background. It needs to be the case that those who are using crypto services or services built on crypto rails need not necessarily know that that's what's going on behind the scenes. I wonder, Brad, whether you could speak a little bit about the pieces of the puzzle that are yet to kind of fit into place to make that a reality.
Well, I mean, I'll use Ripple. I mean, I never want to do a commercial for your own company, but I think what Ripple's been trying to do is go to institutions and deliver a service that their customers have no idea that the cross-border payment they just made went through crypto. And they shouldn't care. It was fast, it was cheap, it was very accurate, and to Richard's point earlier, it settles very, very quickly. The things that I think could be better, for those of us who self-custody, some of those technologies are hard. I heard horror stories, which I don't know if they're true, but people whose wallets were burned down in the fires in LA and their secret keys were in the safe that also is now melted. On one hand, that's the nature of this technology. On the other hand, that's a deterrent to getting more and more people to participate in this economy.
And then how do we then set about kind of threading the needle, recognizing that there are certain kind of facets of the technology on which, perhaps shouldn't be compromised, and then also recognizing that, your grandmother is never going to be...
My slightly tongue-in-cheek answer to that is if I knew the answer to that, I would go start another company and just focus on that. I mean, I'm being somewhat facetious about that, but I think we could all agree that, the nature of how some of this, we expose some of the underlying technology to a consumer, and we can use your uncle, your grandmother, whatever. It's like it's too hard, and we want to invite them in. It is on the positive side. It is as the U.S. regulatory framework changes and the ability for someone to say, I want to buy a Bitcoin ETF through my Fidelity account. Okay, that's not hard. People already know how to do that. But I think there's other examples, and I do think there's lots of entrepreneurs, some of them in this room, that are working on ways to make this more accessible to a larger audience.
Okay, and as we think about bringing in the next tens of millions of users to the crypto space, Richard, when we think of demographic, when we think of kind of geography, who do you imagine that these next 10,000 kind of tens of millions of users will be? Where will they be based? What would the demographic be? What products will they be using?
So the reason why crypto continue to exist and thrive since its very early days is because of the use cases, right? So I travel the world quite extensively. I see those. So the highest and the fastest pace of crypto adoption globally always happen in jurisdiction where financial inclusion is lower and where the demographics is younger, meaning they are much more tax heavy. Because if you ask a person in the 50s and 60s to go and create their own private keys, etc., to do those storage, they may not know how to do it. Right?
I would add a third one, though. I think distrust of the local government also contributes.
Hyperinflationary. Yeah. So you have all, and why is that the case? I mean, this is quite memorable. 2 years ago, I was on a conference like this with an IMF official and then bankers on the other side. I'm only crypto person on that stage, and the bankers were all attacking crypto sector, right? And the IMF person said, "Look, guys, the only reason why crypto exists is because you have not served your fundamental purpose, which is to serve the unbanked, serve the underserved. Globally, 1.4 billion people are still unserved, right, by the banking sector. So, and in all those countries where financial inclusion is 10-20%, crypto is the only mean and the fastest and most efficient mean, going back to the point that I'm making, both for domestic payment as well as cross-border payment. And compared to many of their local currency, where economy is going through hyperinflationary situation, it's a much better store of wealth, right? And I have people coming up to thank me to say, thank you for the Binance platform. It's because of this that we managed to store our wealth vis-a-vis, the neighbor next door, right? That holds it in fiat currency. So I've seen so many of these examples at work. The next billion, I mean, we have about 250 million users on our platform today. To reach the next billion users, which is what our goal is, you need to continue to improve on the UI, UX. You need to continue to improve on the product features. There need to be much more regulatory clarity. But a lot will still hinges on the utility, the innovation that's coming through, the use cases coming through, because they will continue to drive crypto adoption globally, which is why, as a platform, we're agnostic to all the different innovation that we're seeing in this space, and you're seeing very exciting things being built. But we want to be supportive of all the innovation that's coming through, because this represents the use cases that will propel crypto going forward.
Right. I mean, to that end, and I'd like to bring you both in on this next question, but let's start with you, Richard, since you kind of raised the point. I wonder kind of where you think capital might be most efficiently allocated when we think about ushering in this next tens of million, billion users to crypto. I'm thinking particular use cases, particular geographies. What are your thoughts?
Well, it depends on what you're looking for, right? So that's a very difficult, there's too generic a question to ask. But if you look at the very important use cases that crypto has represent, today you have stable coins, you have the remittance space. I mean, if you do crypto remittance, the recipient get it instantaneously at a fraction of a cost compared to what you send via traditional financial institutions. Take 2-3 days, go through 2 correspondent banks sometimes. They charge up to 10-15% of fees, right? So it is so much beneficial using crypto on many of those instances. And you see that narrative being replicated, right? To say that, can we do this? Pascal mentioned lending just now, right? So there are so many things that they are trying to reimagine the future of finance. So it really depends. I mean, in every sector, what we need to continue to focus on are problem statements. What's the problem that this particular technology is trying to solve? And I always believe that if you look at the future world, crypto, blockchain in general, together with AI, will form the fundamental technology that's going to drive every economic subsector going forward. So countries will do very well to focus their attention of how to bring about conducive environment for these two sectors.
Okay, let's bring you in on the same question, Brad. In terms of
I'll throw out two. I mean, what one Ripple is interested in and we think a lot about, and because we are very focused on the enterprise and kind of institutional side, you know, the ability to tokenize real-world assets and make them more accessible, more tradable, I think that is good for the global economy. I think it's good for consumers. I think it's good for businesses. I think it's good for institutions. And so I view that as an inevitability. And the question is, you know, how quickly, which jurisdictions, where does it happen the most quickly? But I very much am a believer, and you know, again, you hear all kinds of crazy ideas about like, what about tokenizing this? And it's stuff I've never thought of that I'm like, oh yeah, I could see why that might make sense to a particular investor class or what have you. The one where Ripple doesn't participate, but I think is interesting, and I think players like Binance might end up being super successful, and I have no idea if they're working on this, but you know, we don't really talk about consumer payment use cases, in large part because many of us come from economies that don't have hyperinflation, that the currency feels reasonably safe. Now, again, as pointed out, I think it was also Chris Giancarlo who said earlier that in the last 4 years, the U.S. government has printed 25% of all the money it's ever printed. And it's kind of like, oh my gosh, you know, not a great factoid and trend line. But that's actually one of the good actors, relatively speaking, if you look at global players. So, you know, it'll be interesting. There's a broader experiment going on in Argentina, as an example, right now, where inflation has gone from very bad to not so bad. But look, if I lived in Argentina, I would be looking for opportunities to not hold the Argentinian peso. Mm-hmm. And you are seeing merchants who now list not just the Argentinian peso price, but a Bitcoin price. I think you will see the crypto leak into consumer use cases in markets that maybe we don't in kind of the G20 economies think as much about. And you know, again, just an area where I think kind of we underestimate what might happen and over the next 10 years.
Right. So do you think it's a mistake often made then, perhaps, you know, among those who live in the US, who live in the UK, who live in developed economies across the world? Is it a mistake to kind of look at crypto too closely through their own prism?
Yeah, for sure. I think Ripple, I mean, it's a natural effect. Like we live in the environments we are. And I think, as Richard described, he spends a lot of time traveling the world. So he sees firsthand some of these things that, unless you've sat down to a restaurant in Argentina and seen the menu list different currencies and how you can potentially pay, you don't kind of appreciate how much interest there might be in non-standard Argentinian peso kind of transactions. So I think that's true in all of life, where we grow up in our environment. And I've always said, like, people talk about, you know, crypto transactions. I remember people getting very excited in like 2016 and 2017. I think Starbucks was going through it, like, hey, we're going to allow crypto payments. I remember thinking, like, why would I do that? I got lots of ways to pay for my Starbucks in the morning, and none of them involve a crypto transaction for a whole bunch of reasons. But I'll leave it at that.
I mean, crypto markets, they're flying high at the moment. I wonder what you think, or kind of how you think that the crypto industry might kind of best capitalize on this period of uplift, right? During bull markets, VCs are far more energetic. People are much more willing to engage. How do you think, Richard, about this?
Can I comment really briefly before you dive in?
Yeah.
I mean, you are appropriately calling we're in a bull market. I get it. There's another way to look at it. Gary Gensler's knee on the neck of the crypto industry was a $1 trillion knee. And so another way to look at it is there's not actually in a bull. It's just it's a recovery from a malfeasance attacking an industry that now it's like, oh, okay, that's gone, and now we've kind of reset. I mean, one of the things we were talking about backstage is if you look at the rally, it's been absolutely led by U.S.-related cryptos who have been at the forefront of the attack from the U.S. government. And it's like, okay, those are coming off, and so those have outperformed the rest of the market. Mm-hmm. That sounds logical to me. It doesn't sound like, in some ways, I would even argue the whole market is not actually, I think we're going to continue to see a lot of positive activity. I just see people laughing. I'm afraid to ask what's it.
Definitely.
We better turn around.
Anonymous, come on. It's not very nice.
Brad, you see the question? Would you care to?
Most of what I will say right now I've said publicly, but look, the reality, most companies that go public do that to raise capital. We haven't needed to raise capital, and so that has not been a driving force. We have talked a little bit about would we go public, and it's like, well, the U.S. market until recently has been very hostile, and like, why would we even try to have that conversation? I mean, I guess the exact answer to the question, will we IPO in 2025? I think that's a definitive no.
Okay.
We're in 2025, and it certainly takes a little bit of time to get there. But I also think you have to ask yourself, okay, how does Ripple benefit from being a public company? And therefore, is it a high priority for us? So what we've said is there's no imminent plans to go public. I will acknowledge that a change in the SEC in the United States, as he said earlier, as conditions change, you never say never, and you reevaluate as you learn new facts.
Yeah. Okay, doesn't sound like a no to me. Okay, next up, we have a question from Stefan Balker. Brad, do you have any clues to why XRP is outracing all of the top coins in the last 8 to 10 weeks?
I mean, I feel like I answered that question already, and that it's kind of, I think you had a U.S. regulator that was, had their knee on the neck of the industry. That came off, and so the U.S., XRP included a number of U.S.-focused technologies that obviously are global, but have been attacked in the U.S. because it's easier for the U.S. government to go after U.S. companies. So that's what has happened. I mean, look, it's hard to predict how these things play out, but is there been U.S. buying? Yes. I mean, look, even today, I'll leave these unnamed, but large institutions, even from derivatives to other things that haven't played around XRP because of the U.S. SEC are now like, oh, now we're going to engage. And so that creates momentum for the XRP ecosystem, which I think is good, and we'll see how it plays out.
Okay, Richard, let me loop back to the question.
Sorry, it's fine.
I apologize.
However you want to characterize this.
No, I mean, definitely market sentiment is positive, right? So whether we are in a bull, I mean, if you look at the fear and greed sentiment, in the barometer, we are okay. We are quite positive now. But if you go by past crypto cycle, we probably see an all-time high this year, right? So I think all those are positive, but for us, we focus on building, right? We want to continue building the best-in-class platform. We have the deepest liquidity pool, and we were having this conversation earlier. Most of the people that are entering into crypto now, ETF is their first port of call. But you realize that the liquidity cost is extremely high going through an ETF because they don't trade at night, they don't trade during weekends, they don't trade during public holidays. And information flow is constant, right? And crypto is 24/7 product, trades, all times 24/7. So people over time will realize that there's a high price to pay for that lack of ability to exit, lack of ability to take positions or hedge their current positions, right? So we are continuing to focus on building the best platform out there, having the deepest liquidity pool, which traders will know that by going through us, they save substantially over time, having the narrowest beta spread on that front. And in fact, we do our best building during bear market, not during bull market. During bull market, you have to be selective because a lot of money are flowing in. People, the valuations are high, the resources are tight. We hire the best talent, we do our best building, probably do the best acquisition during bear market, where people say, nah, it's a gone case. Every time people say, Bitcoin is dead, that's the time that we do our best building, actually. Yeah.
Okay. All right, we only have 1 minute and 20 seconds left, but I want to ask you one more question, and we'll go rapid fire, and we'll hear from you both. I'd be interested in the extent to which you think that kind of historic reputational issues continue to weigh heavily on the businesses who are trying to prove out clear utility for crypto. I'm talking about not only the FTXs of this world, but also the kind of association with degen culture and the rest. Richard, in 30 seconds, how would you answer?
Well, the industry will evolve, right? Binance started in 2017. The landscape then was totally different. Less than 1% global crypto adoption. Regulators are ignoring the space. Institutions are, just waving, say this won't last. Right? by now it's a very different narrative, right? As I mentioned, last year was the best year we ever saw for institutional adoption, and that momentum will carry on. We are still very early in the institutional game, actually, because as you know, many of the institutions, financial institutions, the due diligence process they have to go through will be at least 6 to 9 months to start deploying into crypto, and we're going to see that coming through this year. So we're very early in that cycle, and we are seeing a lot of innovation coming through, and they will continue to drive the crypto narrative.
Okay, Brad?
I'll say +1.
Okay, perfect.
I'm being nice.
Okay, thank you very much to you both.
Thank you.
Good stuff.